Senator Wright.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. On Monday of this week, I had the great pleasure of meeting with 200 enthusiastic, passionate young people who had converged on Parliament from all over Australia with a very clear message for the parliamentarians that they were meeting with and also wishing to communicate with, and that was that the choices, our choices in this place this week, would determine their future. These were young people from the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, the AYCC, and I know some of them are in the gallery there, so I welcome them along to Parliament tonight. AYCC, Mr. Acting Deputy President, is a youth-run organisation that has a mission of building a movement of young Australians to empower them to take action on climate change. It's an incredibly impressive organisation. Since some of my own children have been involved in it, I've been on a real journey of understanding about what they do, and it's now one of Australia's largest youth-run organisations with a stunning membership of more than 115,000 members. I love working and meeting with AYCC people because they are smart, they're passionate and they're committed to working together. They're also effective and they are disciplined. In fact, their discipline and their commitment to what they're doing would put a lot of organisations staffed and with memberships of older Australians to shame. And that's because they are essentially taking responsibility for the future, for the way our future can proceed in terms of dealing with catastrophic climate change that we're facing, and they're taking that responsibility in a way that indeed I look around me and see many of our leaders are not prepared to take responsibility. And I think that's because they know that it's their futures which are at stake if we do not act decisively and effectively on climate change. So AYCC enables young people to take action in their communities to put climate change and climate issues in the national spotlight. So on Monday, we heard, among others, from inspiring campaigner with Repower Port Augusta in my own home state of South Australia, Daniel Spencer, who has been working long and hard in partnership with a very impressive community group, the Port Augusta Community and the Port Augusta Repower Port Augusta Alliance, again, as I said, in my home state of South Australia. And their work is to see the dirty, outdated coal power station there, which has been causing health issues for the Port Augusta community for decades, transition to a solar thermal power station of the future, which would be a wonderful thing for South Australia to celebrate and to achieve. Just last week, we were very pleased to hear that Alinta Energy has announced that they will pursue a feasibility study into the efficacy and into the possibility of a standalone solar thermal power station with storage in Port Augusta. And that was a very exciting decision that Alinta made to look at that kind of a power station, because the storage technology would of course give the capacity to provide base load power, which means that power would be available from the power station whether the sun happens to be shining that day or indeed overnight or not. So that was some very encouraging and positive news in what has been, I've got to say, a pretty dispiriting week for people around Australia who care about having a safe and livable climate for future generations. I would congratulate Daniel Spencer and the Repower Port Augusta Alliance for their ongoing dedicated advocacy for solar thermal and a safer, healthier, more prosperous future for the Port Augusta community, and indeed we would all benefit as well. Recently, representatives from AYCC also visited me in my electorate office to ask me to sign up to their Safe Climate Roadmap, and Daniel and Rachel visited me that day, and I was delighted to be able to sit down with them and discuss their vision for a safe climate future. The AYCC Safe Climate Roadmap is ambitious but pretty simple. It has three aims. One is to reduce our carbon pollution in line with what we know, in line with the science, which is incontrovertible now. The second aspect is to transition Australia's energy to 100% renewables within 10 years. And the third aspect is to move Australia beyond coal and gas. We can't ignore the evidence any longer, and certainly that's the view of the AYCC young people. They know climate change is already here. Australians are already experiencing the impacts of climate change with more extreme heat waves, rainfall, fire, floods and droughts. In the past 12 months, we've had Australia's hottest year, breaking over 123 weather records and sparking the earliest ever start to the bushfire season. The predictions about what climate change would bring and look like that were made in the late 80s and early 90s are actually happening now in 2014. In my home state of South Australia, people are telling me about droughts and more extreme weather events and how they're affecting their daily lives and their economic future. So climate change in South Australia is a threat to our wine regions. Grapevines are particularly sensitive to temperatures during the growing season. If average temperatures change, many areas in South Australia may no longer be suitable for wine production. And that matters to us because it's an industry which employs more than 10,000 South Australians and makes a significant contribution to the state economy. If we don't take strong action right now, the science is clear. Our destabilising climate would bring huge and irreversible impacts on Australia's prosperity, our health, our well-being and our environment. But one of the things that I love is meeting with the young people of AYCC because they are optimistic. They're not all about doom and gloom. They see climate change not just as a threat but as an opportunity, and indeed they help me to see what an opportunity it can be. Because although Australia is one of the biggest polluters and exporters of coal and gas in the world, we're also one of the sunniest and windiest countries. So that means we can transition to 100% renewable energy in just 10 years if we put our minds to it and we decide that that is a priority, and that's what we're going to do. So the Safe Climate Roadmap is a plan to protect our climate for this generation and generations to come. Clearly, Australians overwhelmingly support ambitious action on climate change, and the roadmap is just reflecting what is in fact a popular view. A 2014 Lowy Institute poll found that 63% of respondents believed that the government should be taking a leadership role in reducing carbon emissions, and only 7% thought that the government should be doing nothing. As part of the roadmap, people all across the country have been sharing their stories about why they are passionate about this issue, and the stories are varied and compelling. There was one story that I was taken with, and that was Jamali's story. Jamali's from Charleville in Queensland, and Jamali, and I'll quote from Jamali, he said, "I'm a young Aboriginal Bidjara man. The traditional Bidjara language is nearly extinct, and so my connection to the land and the environment is really all of my culture that I have left. I care about climate change because for thousands of years me and my ancestors have heavily relied on the land and all that it provides for us, and climate change will jeopardise this relationship. In my hometown of Charleville, there are several proposals for coal seam gas wells. I'm worried about the impact that these projects will have on native species, plants, sacred places, our waters and our climate. We have the technology to power Australia with renewable energy that is clean and sustainable. It's time we stopped digging up coal and gas and look towards a greener future." And this is Maddie's story, and Maddie hails from Mount Barker, a city on the outskirts of Adelaide in my home state of South Australia. Maddie says, "When I first heard about climate change, I was frightened by the devastating impacts already occurring on our planet. I felt powerless in the face of such a big, urgent and seemingly hopeless problem. But at some point I realised that we do have power to make a change in Australia. We are huge polluters but have equally huge potential for renewable energy. The opportunity we have to make a positive change inspired me to start a climate change action group at my school when I was 16. I care about climate because I care about people. Everything that we need, food, water, clean air and a safe and beautiful environment to live in, is dependent on a healthy climate. Globally, we do not have the capacity to deal with more extreme weather events like bushfires, cyclones and flooding without experiencing catastrophic impacts on human life. I want to see a solar thermal power plant at Port Augusta. I want to see a stop to the investment in coal and a start to the investment in renewable energy. I won't stop fighting until we as a nation take some responsibility for the lives of future generations. We know that climate change is an issue that without swift and meaningful action will have an impact on many different aspects of our lives. We have in Australia the opportunity and the resources to be a world leader in climate change mitigation, but we're falling behind. Nations around the world are taking decisive action on protecting our climate, while here in Australia we face the repeal of legislation that is actively working to reduce our carbon emissions. This is not the way to go. International institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank are strongly encouraging countries to implement pollution pricing schemes. And I must confess that although I am a resolutely optimistic person, because I think the alternative isn't worth considering, I have been pretty disheartened of late. We have very good climate change mitigation legislation in place, and yet we have a government inexplicably trying to take us backwards. Since the carbon tax was introduced, Australia's annual greenhouse gas emissions, excluding land sources, have fallen 1% or 5.2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. More than 1 million Australians now have solar photovoltaic systems installed in their homes, a huge commitment to renewable energy. This government is trying to reduce laws that make sense and that work and will secure a sustainable future for our country. Scientists and politicians have been talking about climate change for decades, but as decision-makers at the highest level here and in Australia, we have not done enough. The decisions that we make between now and 2020 will determine the severity of climate change that future generations like my children and their children and the young people from AYCC and the young people throughout Australia will experience. And that's why I'm inspired by the leadership that an organisation like AYCC shows, because Australians care about climate change, Australians care about the effects that climate change will have on future generations, and these young people of the AYCC are taking responsibility to do something about it. I wish we could say the same about the Government of Australia. And now I'm